Okay, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about Neolithic and Megalithic art. Now I realized when I gave the last lecture I didn't stop to talk a little bit about dates, and so I probably should. So I actually added a couple of slides to this lecture. So if you don't see these on the PDF, don't worry, I will update the PDF so these are there. I felt like we ought to talk a little bit about dating terminology, because not everybody knows what these terms mean. So when we talk about the Stone Age, what we're talking about, of course, is a level of technology. We call it the Stone Age because the principal technology that people used was stone tools, such as these Acheulean hand axes. And we break the Stone Age up into three big categories. The Old Stone Age, which is the Paleolithic, and that starts at around 2.5 million years BP. And BP is just a term we use to mean before present. So it's kind of a relative term. The most significant period of the Paleolithic is the Upper Paleolithic. This is the very tail end of the Paleolithic, and it's about circa, and that's what circa means. It means about, in case you were wondering. Every time you see that little C with a period behind it, that means circa, or about. 50,000 years before the present. So this is the era of the Ice Age technological revolution with their needles, scrapers, bifacial blades, harpoons, etc. This is also the era of cave art. Then we have the Mesolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age, and it starts again circa 20,000 years before the present. And it's kind of the smallest era. It's this transition era before we get to the New Stone Age, the Neolithic. No one ever said that archaeologists suffered from an overabundance of imagination. These terminologies. And the Neolithic is generally regarded to begin somewhere around circa, again, 12,000 years before the Common Era. Now, that's BCE. And what does BCE? Well, it means before the Common Era, and the Common Era is just before year zero. And so on the traditional Christian calendar, we start with the year zero, and that's supposedly the year that Christ was born, but the truth is that it's actually not. We know that Jesus Christ was born somewhere around the year 4 to 7 BC. Why? Because they actually got it wrong. When they started dating from the birth of Christ, somebody added up all the dates wrong, and so we actually know that year zero isn't the birth of Christ. It's actually quite a few years after the birth of Christ, so it's kind of arbitrary. This is exactly identical to BC. So if you've ever seen BC and you start to see BCE, it means exactly the same thing. But instead of saying before Christ, it's before the Common Era. Why do we do this? Well, for one, the date isn't accurate anyway. Year zero is a few years after the birth of Christ. But the other reason is we're talking about a lot of cultures that aren't necessarily Christian. And so for the sake of sensitivity, we don't want to use a term that is exclusive to Christian civilization. We want to be more inclusive than that. So that's what that means. And so you'll also see the antecedent to that, which is if you have before the Common Era, you have Common Era. And so Common Era is everything after the year zero. And the New Stone Age is a period where we have the invention of a lot of fiber arts, ceramics, the bow and arrow, but of course the two big ones are going to be animal domestication and agriculture. Now, I do want to stress that when we're talking about this kind of terminology, it's always important to know that these are relative terms, that they're dependent on technological developments, not absolute dates. What does that mean? Well, that means that just because one culture is in the Neolithic period, it doesn't mean that all cultures are in the Neolithic period at the same time. Almost all cultures started at a Stone Age with stone technology, but some evolved very quickly and developed things like bronze and iron, and others didn't. And so different cultures reach technological development at different paces. And so this sometimes creates some interesting incongruities, let's put it that way. For example, Stonehenge. Stonehenge is this monument that was made during the Neolithic period in what is now the British Isles. But it's actually built contemporaneous to the Great Pyramids at Giza. So both the Neolithic Stonehenge and the Bronze Age pyramids were built in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, which is funny. But one is a Bronze Age monument and the other is a Neolithic monument, even though they're built at exactly the same time. Why? Because the people in the British Isles hadn't discovered bronze yet. They were on the verge of discovering bronze, but hadn't quite got there. And so they were still a Stone Age culture. And truthfully, there are still some cultures on the planet today that are functionally Stone Age cultures. You may have heard of the Bushmen of the Kalahari down in Africa, who right up until the 20th century were living pretty much a Stone Age culture, while the rest of us had moved past the Industrial Revolution and into the Information Age. So it's always important to remember these things are relative dates. They're never ever hard and fast dates. And some cultures are out of the Neolithic really quick. The cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt get out of the Stone Age really quick, whereas for most of Europe and the rest of the world, they linger on in the Stone Age for quite a long while. All right, so we're going to start this in an interesting place. We're actually going to start this in a place that you don't think of as a place full of life and innovation, and that's going to be the Sahara Desert right down here. Now, as you look at this on the satellite map, you can tell it's a pretty bleak space. And again, Utah is a lush paradise compared to this. It is an absolute desert, but it wasn't always a desert. In fact, a little over 10,000 years ago, it was a lush veldt. It was a savanna with lots of grasslands, and lots of people lived there. And not just people, but animals. And we know this because they carved pictures of those animals into the rock. So this is in the middle of a very bleak desert in the middle of Nigeria, the Tenere Desert. But here you can clearly see 2 giraffes that have been carved into the rock. There are no giraffes living in this region today. It's far too dry, but they lived there at the time. And so this was actually a very nice place to live. And it's here where we have all of this rock art carved into the rock or painted onto the rock surfaces, and it actually records their history. So we get a sense of these developments, these Neolithic developments. Again, Neolithic is a technological term. It's when did a culture pass a certain level. And what we see is at the end of the Ice Age, around 9000 BCE, when the Sahara Desert is still a kind of lush grassland, we see people moving from hunter-gatherers to pastoralism. What do we mean by that? A hunter-gatherer is someone who everything that they eat has to be either gathered from the wild or killed, hunted, and there is no other means of food production. But pretty quickly in the Neolithic, and beginning in the Mesolithic actually, in the Mesolithic we first domesticated dogs, or they domesticated us, that's still a debate. But we figured out how to domesticate animals, and that's really great, because it means you don't have to kill the animal to sustain yourself. You could keep the animal alive and you can milk it, and you can eat the milk, you can herd the animal, you can direct it. So now, instead of having to hunt your food source, you can take your food source around with you. And around this time period, people move to pastoralism, and pastoralism is herding. It's moving animals around. Now, they're still not growing their own food. They're raising their own animals, so they have to move the animals around the grassland because otherwise they would overgraze an area. So these people are nomadic. They move around, and we see these people develop in North Africa and the ancient Near East. And this means that they now have a food surplus. If you're not constantly hunting, you now have more time to devote to developing a rich material culture. And I want to stress this point. Nothing in the world happens without a surplus. You know, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you're basically going from hand to mouth. And if you don't have any extra food stores, and it's very hard to store food if you're a hunter-gatherer because it rots so quick, you basically don't have the time to develop things like a bow and arrow or fiber arts, baskets, nets, or anything else. So a food surplus means that people can specialize in labor. It means that they can actually move forward and develop new trades, new professions. Maybe you're not the best hunter, and so now you can dedicate your time to something like basket weaving. And that means that now people can diversify, and if this person's really good at doing baskets and you're really good at hunting, then you can trade. This is the laws of comparative advantage if you're interested in such obscure economic terms. But it really means we see an increase in the material culture. And not surprisingly, we see an increase in art as well. And you can see this. These beautiful panels that come from Algeria in North Africa from this time period. And here you can see they have, I'm just going to highlight some of these little corrals to corral animals. You can see that they're herding and lining animals up. You can see that they're herding the animals. And here we have goats and cattle. It's really kind of neat. So looking at our timeline, the Ice Age is slowly coming to an end by about the year 9000 or so. And the hunters and gatherers that had dominated start to disappear. There's always going to be pockets of hunters-gatherers somewhere. And we start to see this development. And we see that they move away from the spear throwers to bows and arrows, which are a lot more efficient. And we can see that the art becomes a lot more developed too. Look at how naturalistic and beautiful these are. And also look how well proportioned the humans are. And look at how he depicts the calves or the elegant kind of limbs of the bow. It's really quite lovely. The largest pocket of this rock art that we can find is in Tassili, Niger, which is in Algeria. It's right in the middle of this bleak Sahara desert. I mean, it really is bleak. Take a look at that. There's hardly any vegetation at all. It looks like Hanksville, Utah. If I have any students from Hanksville, Utah, no offense, but when they went to go practice the lunar rovers for the Apollo program, they took them to Hanksville, Utah, because it was almost like the moon. It's really bleak. So now imagine a whole region like that. That's what it's like. But it wasn't like that 9,000, 10,000 years ago. 9,000, 10,000 years ago, it was actually quite lush. And you can see that in the rock art. In the rock art, we see people that seem to be spreading nets, herding animals using bows and arrows. We see depictions of boats. We see people in a variety of clothing. These wonderfully depicted figures. Figures engaged in some kind of either activity or making things. And we see all varieties of these. We see enclosures for animals or houses, cows, and these really wonderful, beautiful, organic forms to the figures. We see the development of the bow and people using the bow, etc. So these are really quite beautiful, and part of the reason we have this beautiful, rock art. This isn't in caves. These are just rock shelters. These are just overhangs, open overhangs, very similar to what we have across the American Southwest in rock art. Excuse me, coughed into the elbow, just so you know. And this is largely, again, because we have a surplus, because the food allows people to live this way. Well, now we're going to move to the Near East. So we move away from North Africa and the Sahara Desert, and we're going to be moving into this region, the Middle East. And an awful lot of the activity that we're going to talk about from here on, either in the Neolithic or in the Bronze Age, is going to be happening in this region. And there's two major regions we're going to be talking about. One is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that literally means between the two rivers. And you can see the two rivers here. There's one, and there's the other. And they snake down to the Persian Gulf. This is the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so you have all of these high mountains up here, and they draw water down through this desert. So even though this is a abject desert, this is the modern state of Iraq. This is Kuwait down here. but this is the modern state of Iraq, even though it's very, very dry, this ends up being a very lush place to grow food because you have water and because you can irrigate. The same thing is true of the Levant. The Levant is the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean that includes Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, and then Turkey up here. We'll also be talking about Turkey a bunch too. And so it's in this region that we have what's known as the agricultural revolution. So we talked about the technological revolution was one of the first revolutions. The agricultural revolution is the next. And it takes an enormously long period of time. And it happens in fits and spurts. People realize that, moving animals around, you're kind of at the mercy of whether there's plants or not. And if there are plants for the animals to graze on, you're good. But if there's not, your animals quickly starve, and then if your animals starve, you starve. So they start figuring out how to replant plants. They actually burn grasslands and knock the heads of tall grasses down to spread seed and propagate seed so that animals will have more grass. And then eventually they figure out how to collect these seeds and grind them into flour to make bread. And so we have the development of agrarian societies in the Levant and the Near East. And this is really made possible because of irrigation, that they can take rivers and they can build channels that will take water to fields. These fields, they can use animals to plow the fields, and this will allow them to grow a food source. Now, the biggest thing that this does is it allows you to settle down. You don't have to settle down. You don't have to wander around, with your animals. You can grow your own food. You're still at the mercy of a drought, but it's a lot more dependable than even animal domestication. And this allows you to build permanent villages and permanent buildings for the first time because you don't have to move around. And we see a huge explosion in material culture. And we break the Neolithic into periods based on, again, these technological developments. One of the things they've developed is ceramics, and we break the Neolithic into the pre-pottery Neolithic, the PPN, which happens about before 6000 BCE, and the pottery Neolithic, which is PN. And that's also broken down into the various different stages, and that's about after 6000 BC. And so around 6000 BC, we start to see ceramic pots. Now, people had been modeling things in clay for a long time, but just for the fun of it and just for making, kind of little figures like those bison. But they started to figure out that if you work the clay, you work all of the air bubbles out of it and put it in a fire or a kiln, you can actually harden it. This is not an easy thing to figure out. It obviously took centuries for them to work out all the details. If you failed to knead all of the air bubbles out of your clay and you put that in a kiln, then your project could end up exploding and wiping out all of the other projects of, Ceramics 101 course. And I just speaking in a hypothetical sense. And then maybe you get depressed and go into something like art history instead. Moving on. So it's actually quite hard to figure this out, to actually make ceramics and to decorate ceramics. We also see an increase in fiber arts. They're not just doing baskets and sandals, they start weaving cloth. Cloth from the wool of the animals that they use and also from other sources, linen and cotton. We also see the first metalworking. We sometimes call the tail end of the Neolithic period the Chalcolithic, and Chalco just means copper. That they start working copper into ornaments and simple tools. So this was the prevailing, understanding of the world that we had. And again, this is another one of those things. When I was an undergrad and I was in school, this is how we were taught, that we had the age of the hunters and gatherers. At the same time, we have the development of farmers. This allows for permanent buildings and defenses in places like Jericho and Catalhoyuk, and that we weren't going to find any big monuments or significant monuments before this. Nope, that was it. We were done. You can't build big monuments like this unless you have agriculture, because you need the food surplus to make it happen. And then the dumb archaeologists kept digging, and they found a little place called Gobekli Tepe, which turned everything upside down. So let's talk about Gobekli Tepe and why it's so significant. Gobekli Tepe is a Turkish word, and it just means pot-bellied hill. It's a tiny little hill in the southeastern district of Turkey. So here's the eastern Mediterranean. This is Levant. These are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that goes down through Iraq. This is Syria. So it's close to the border of Syria. I have a little video that will hopefully show you where this is. And hopefully it'll zoom down in on this so you can take a look at it. So this was a site that wasn't considered terribly significant. In the 1960s, an archaeological survey went and looked at this hill, and they concluded that this was a medieval graveyard and there was nothing else there. But in the early 1990s, a German archaeologist by the name of Klaus Schmidt actually went and took a look at this nondescript hill, and he dug into it, and he found absolutely amazing structures. A series of circular structures, and in those circular structures were large T-shaped monoliths, just gigantic things, some of them weighing up to 15 tons. Here's another view of this. These were surrounded by stone walls. Here's another view of these T-shaped monoliths. So this was quite surprising. This was not something that anybody was expecting. And he knew right away that this wasn't a medieval graveyard. He knew right away this had to be something far more significant. And so he started excavating it, and not only were the T-shaped monoliths impressive, but they were covered in really beautiful relief carvings. When he started looking at the relief carvings, he noticed that almost all of the animals on these relief carvings were wild animals: boars, scorpions, vultures. There was not a single thing that was a domesticated animal, which was interesting. Here's a picture of Klaus Schmidt standing next to one of his discoveries. Here are a couple more of some of these T-shaped monoliths. You can see that it has vultures, scorpions, a wild boar. This one has a leopard carved into it. And he started digging around. Whenever somebody makes something this big, you assume they're going to have a trash pit nearby. And he was a very good archaeologist from the Deutsche Archaeologisches Institut, so he went and dug up the trash pits. Archaeology, it's so glamorous, digging up thousands of years old trash. But it turns out that trash is very informative because it can tell you what the people ate and what their lifestyle was like. And he noticed something very strange. He was expecting to find the bones of sheep and goats because he assumed this was a Neolithic site, and he was putting it somewhere around 5,000, 6,000 BC. The reason he was putting it there is because there was no pottery, so it probably was right before, so it was the pre-pottery Neolithic. But he discovered something else, that the bones that he was looking at, all of the bones were from things like gazelles and antelope. There was not a single domesticated animal. They were all wild animals. And his first thought was, well, maybe they're building a site where there's a ritual, and part of the ritual is that you eat wild animals. And so that maybe the goats or the sheep would be someplace else. But he looked and he looked and he couldn't find anything. And it suddenly began to dawn on him that this was a place that was built not just before pottery, but that it was built before agriculture, and that it may have been built before the advent of even animal domestication. That's just kind of shocking. He was arguing that this was being built by hunters and gatherers. I want to stress why that's so important. That's why I had that conversation about agriculture. Nothing in the world happens without surplus. So if you're a bunch of hunter and gatherers, you have to spend a lot of time hunting and gathering. But when you look at the sophistication of these monoliths, when you look at the scale of it. This is not something that you could do with you and a couple friends in an afternoon in between hunts. This was something that you would have to organize hundreds or possibly thousands of people over a very long time. And to make these incredible enclosures, what many people now are calling the First Temple, and pushing these monoliths into position, you would have had to have had rollers and ropes and teams of dozens of men. You would have had to have skilled artists, and that doesn't happen overnight. You have to have a generation after generation of people learning how to carve things, learning how to carve the gates and set stones, or learning how to make these huge monoliths. You have to teach your children how to do this, and people have to specialize in doing this. This is not something you can just pull off on a whim. And that strongly suggests that if that's the case, that they had diversification of labor, they had complex social stratification, that they had societies numbering in the hundreds and possibly the thousands. Up until this point, we had thought that pre-agricultural people, hunters and gatherers in the Neolithic, just weren't up to this, that they just weren't sophisticated enough, that maybe they lived in small tribes of, 20 to 30, or at the most 60 to 80 people, just basically an extended family. And this shattered all of those notions. This just absolutely shattered it. And so he wanted to confirm this, so he actually did what every good scientist should do. He took the bone samples and he split them into 4 equal parts, and he sent them to 4 different labs. Didn't tell them where they came from, just said, give me a date on these. And they carbon dated them. Now, carbon dating is a little bit complicated, but everything that you eat is slightly radioactive. I hope you're aware of that. If you had a banana this morning, you are now more radioactive than the person who didn't have a banana. That's because there's these wonderful things called radioactive isotopes. Radioactive isotopes are regular old atoms, like carbon or potassium or whatever, but they happen to have an extra neutron or 2. And that makes them just slightly radioactive. The thing about radioactive isotopes is that they decay. They slowly give off particles, gamma rays or beta rays, until they become stable. So carbon-14 is the important one. Carbon-14 has a couple little extra nuggets in its nucleus, and as it decays, it eventually decays down to stable, good old carbon-12, which is not radioactive and doesn't decay. The rate of this decay is incredibly regular. It is like a clock. In fact, they can actually make clocks based on radioactive decay. It's atomic clocks. They're very accurate. Now, the thing about animals is that, and creatures and us, is that we continue to ingest small traces of this radioactive carbon-14 for our entire lives. And then when you die, you stop ingesting it, because dead things don't eat anymore, unless you're a zombie. And I don't think there were any zombie antelope or gazelles living in Turkey at the time. So that means that with no new radioactive isotopes coming in, the bones begin to decay, and as they decay, they give off a little bit of extra radiation. And so you could look at a bone and you can measure exactly how much carbon-14 is in it. And because carbon-14 decays at a very set rate, what we call its half-life, you can tell exactly how old it is. Now, there's some variation. Some areas of the world have a little bit more carbon-14 than other places, but you can usually get it down within a few hundred years. Sometimes you can get it down within like 50 or 25 years if you have a good enough sample. And every one of these labs dated these bones to somewhere around 10,000 to 11,500 BCE. And that's just remarkable. That's long before the advent of agriculture, and all the evidence suggests that the people who were doing this, who were building these wonderful T-shaped monoliths, who were carving these incredible reliefs, some of the first sculptures in the round, this sculpture here of a human being, maybe the first ever sculpture in the round of a human being. This really beautiful leopard who's been carved on the face of one of these T-shaped monoliths. All of this was being done by hunter-gatherers. And this upturns the apple cart to a great degree. How do hunters and gatherers have the food resources in order to pull this off? And we really don't know the answer to that question. Our best guess is that they may have been practicing something like quasi-domestication. This is something that Native Americans and Amerindians all over North and South America practiced. That is, instead of domesticating the animal, you domesticate the environment. If you kill all the predators in an environment and you burn the prairie, that propagates more grasses, so you suddenly have an overpopulation of deer or antelope, and so you have plenty of animals to hunt. And they may have done something like this. And this allowed them to feed the work crews who were clearly dedicated to building these amazing structures that we see here. This incredible art. So, but this begs the question that what is it that actually makes culture tick? And what we discovered is that our thinking prior to this was that you had to have agriculture. Agriculture gave you a food base. This is what caused you to have large societies, big stratified societies with a chieftain at the top, and etc. And it now turns out that that may be exactly the opposite, that the social stratification, the structure came first, and that it was only when these people became populous enough that they were pushing their environment to its limits. You can only imagine, they must have had hundreds of hunters scouring the countryside to kill enough gazelles and antelope to feed the people building this thing. You can only imagine, but they were really probably pushing their environment to the limit, and it's only after they had become so complex, so incredibly socially organized, so incredibly skilled, building truly monumental structures at Gobekli Tepe, that only then did they actually then figure out agriculture. So that really is surprising. It suggests that the cultural things precede the technological things, that we developed social stratification and societies long before. Now, that's probably pretty smart. It makes sense, because when you think about large societies, if you're talking about a small tribe of 60 to 80 people, you're probably related to everybody in that tribe. And the head of the tribe, the elder or chief of the tribe, is probably something like your grandfather or your great uncle. It's somebody that you know, and you can trust them because you're all family. But as societies get into the hundreds and the thousands, the guy who's leading the tribe is not going to be a relation. He's not going to be your grandfather or a great uncle. He's going to be somebody that you're no relation to at all. And the question becomes, how can you trust him to lead your society? And the answer is religion. That religion is the glue that holds society together, and it's the thing that inspires them to come together to build magnificent structures like this. In fact, there's a little bit of evidence here that that's what this is. It's a temple. If you look at the T-shaped monoliths, you'll notice that they have hands. You can actually see these hands wrapping around the front of the monoliths. These are meant to represent people. They represent them very abstractly, but they meant to represent people. They also have little loincloths down the front, which is kind of interesting. This one has a belt and a little loincloth. That strongly suggests that maybe these are ancestors, or perhaps gods, and that it is the appeasing of these ancestors or gods that really is what brought people together, that allowed them to organize, and that the organization comes first. That once the organization happens, then, and only then, can people, do things like build irrigation and work together to achieve the kind of societies that we're looking into. But it's still an abject marvel. First of all, it's a miracle that we discovered this place. And I really want to stress how big this is. So if we imagine a timeline with the remote past into the tail end of the Mesolithic or the Neolithic, and if you imagine the other line on the other side, the present. So Gobekli Tepe is built somewhere around 11,500 to 10,000 BC. Jericho is built maybe around 9,000 BCE. Catalhoyuk, one of our first Neolithic villages, is built around 6,000 BCE. Sumer and the invention of writing and the first true civilization is around 3,400 BCE. The pyramids are around 2,500. Stonehenge is a little bit after that. And then around the year 7 to 4 BCE is the birth of Christ. And then everything else after that is right up until the present time. So if you think about this, the time span from us right today to the foundation of human history in the year 3,400 or so is about, 5,400 years. So this thing is farther from the beginning of civilization than we are. Okay, it's easily thousands of years older, further away from the foundations of Ur and Uruk and Sumeria, the first true civilizations, than we are. That's incredibly ancient. And of course, it also opens up this enormous problem. This is kind of like finding a steam engine in the Middle Ages. It shouldn't be there. In fact, every scientist, every archaeologist, anthropologist pretty much declared that this was impossible, but there it is. And finding such sophisticated stuff before the advent of agriculture suggests that humans are a lot more clever and a lot more capable than we ever gave them credit for. And so it begs the question, that's why that red question mark is there, what else are we missing? If we could miss Gobekli Tepe, if we could just, miss this, then there's certainly a lot more out there that we don't even know about, and we can't even begin to fathom. I'm not going to go into ancient astronauts or, territory. I think that's ridiculous. But it is true that there's a lot more out there than we ever could have guessed. This was called in the press as the first temple, but the one thing I can tell you for certain is it's not the first temple. This thing is too sophisticated to have been the first temple. There must have been some developmental stages to this point. This is easily the 40th or 50th temple, and there's probably earlier temples out there, maybe hundreds of earlier temples. Then project this a little bit further. So think about the timeline going all the way back to Gobekli Tepe, then think about the timeline going back to the Venus of Willendorf, and one of the earliest cave arts, Chauvet Cave. There could be so much back there we don't understand and have no knowledge of. It's really, really quite incredible. So Gobekli Tepe is rewriting the textbooks. It's not in most of the modern textbooks, frankly. When I started teaching about it about 10 years ago, none of the textbooks had it. Now they're starting to catch up for good reason. It really is a phenomenal site and rewrites our understanding of human history, both what humans have done and what they're capable of doing. But for most of the history of the Neolithic, it's really going to be agricultural developments first. And so everywhere else we see the development of agriculture. So you can understand why we didn't expect something like Gobekli Tepe. Another site in Turkey that's very famous, which is where all the textbooks on Neolithic began when I was a student, is a place called Catalhoyuk. Catalhoyuk is a little city, and you can see it. It's right there in central Anatolia. So Gobekli Tepe is over here, so it's right in the neighborhood, a couple hundred miles away, but still. And it was one of the earliest agrarian communities. There's not much there today to look at, just some low mud brick walls. Again, mud brick, when I taught in Pennsylvania, nobody believed you could build things out of mud brick. And then I taught in Texas, in far west Texas, where people were still building in mud brick. It's really quite amazing. and they were, still constructing things in mud brick. So mud brick is a great material. It's essentially adobe. It's just mud mixed with straw or plant matter to keep the mud together. It's a great insulator. It's cheap. It goes up pretty quick. And they used it to build this communal structure. Now, there actually is a lot of advantages to living this way. One, you have common walls, so that means there's less to build, but you can also make it defensive. There's no ground floor access to this entire building, which means that if you actually came upon this, all they'd have to do is lift up the ladders, and you would never, ever be able to get in unless you scaled the walls somehow. So we can see that people in the Neolithic are, already have better defensive instincts than all 7 seasons of The Walking Dead. When we get into this, we can see that there are common walls, and there's kind of units that probably represent family units. But there's also open courtyards. These are where you could get air, but also where you could dump trash. And there's also community shrines. When we look at the individual buildings, they often have raised levels to the floors. You can see that here in this reconstruction. This might be pragmatic. It might be a place for sorting grain or just to get it up off the floor, or they might have some kind of ritual purpose. We don't really know. The ritual purpose, they were probably places reserved for offerings, either offerings of animals, and these were decorated with animal horns, and you can see that in this reconstruction. Now, this was built after the invention of ceramic, so we actually have some of the first ceramic sculptures in the world come from this site. This is one of the most famous. This is the Earth Goddess, or the Mother Goddess, on a leopard throne, although we're not entirely certain it's a leopard. The head has been reconstructed, so we don't know what the head of this thing would have looked like, but it's definitely fired ceramic. There's been a debate about whether she is pregnant or giving birth. I think the most important thing is she's clearly, again, one of these figures that is emphasizing the abdomen, the hips, the breasts, those things that are associated with childbirth and child rearing. And there is a trend to a lot of the goddesses in this region that associates them with wild animals, with leopards and other things. It's kind of interesting. Men seem to be associated with things like cows and sheep and goats, domesticated animals, and women are associated with undomestic animals, wild animals. Make of that what you will, but there does seem to be a general cult amongst Indo-European peoples throughout this region and Semitic peoples through this region where there is a worship of a great mother goddess. I was rather skeptical of this at first, but the more you look into it, the more evidence there is that this is, in fact, some kind of pan-cultural phenomenon to these people. And so there's some kind of mother or fertility cult going on here. We also have what might be the first ever history painting or landscape painting. On a wall was a fresco, a wall painting, and this showed a double-peaked mountain. And in fact, there is a double-peaked mountain right nearby. And this clearly looks to be a kind of aerial view or schematic of the actual village itself. And you'll notice that one of the peaks seems to be erupting. And in fact, the peak is a volcano, and it erupted around this time. So Catalhoyuk is kind of an interesting thing because it was occupied and flourished for about 400, 500 years, and then it was abandoned, and they walked away from it. And maybe that's why they abandoned it. Maybe it was because of an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. So going back to our map now, we're going to hone in on this area. This is the Eastern Mediterranean, and this is what we call the Levant. And so going back to our map of the Middle East, you can see the Levant is, again, the coast of Israel. So we have over here, just to get my pen, so this is Egypt and Sinai, this is Gaza right here, this is Israel, this is the West Bank and Palestine, then this is Lebanon here, and then this is Syria, and then up in here is to Turkey. This is the tail end of Cyprus here. And right here, just north of the Dead Sea, is a place known as Tel Es-Sultan, which is more commonly known as Jericho. And yes, this is the Jericho from the Bible. This city has an extraordinarily long history of occupation. While it was certainly occupied in biblical times, this little mound here, and there it is, you'll see it right through here, and there it is right there. This mound, which is not, terribly impressive when you look at it today, was the home of one of the earliest Neolithic villages, and it looks like habitation there dated to around 9,000 BC. So this was after they had invented agriculture, but before they had invented pottery. So this is the pre-pottery ceramic. And it has a few notable structures. Again, one of the things that indicates that you have a real organized society is you have defensive structures. So this is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world, and it has a watchtower, a defensive structure. We also find some plastered skulls from this time period. Looking at the watchtower, it's funny because when you go to the site today, you actually look down onto the watchtower, but that's because buildings got built up, and if you have thousands of years of being built up, the watchtower is now at the bottom of a hole. But once upon a time, it was at the top of the hill. So all of the rest of this is human action that has buried it. It's kind of amazing. But it once was a tower on the top of a hill, and it had a passageway that went up to the top of it. Of course, towers are very useful because you can see there's the modern grate covering the ancient passageway. You can go up to it, and if somebody comes up to the tower, you can easily throw rocks down on them and defend yourself from them. We also find these plastered skulls. I mentioned these in the last class, talking about how they represent this transition towards portraiture. These are human skulls, and again, this is an attempt to preserve the body. The preservation of the body for the afterlife is a major fixation for a lot of these cultures, right through the Neolithic and onward. And this is also where we get the origins of portraiture. So it seems that they would have buried their dead for a short time, where the body could rot, and then they would disinter the body, take the skull. The skull is where the soul or the anima or life force of the body is believed to exist. And they actually went through a very elaborate preparation. These were actually sealed in bitumen. Bitumen is this tar-like deposit that you can get, like asphalt actually. They would seal up the interior of it, cover it over with a thin layer of plaster, and I mentioned that they would even put shells into the eyes because the shells are shiny like an eye and they're wet. You can see that they cared a great deal to get some of the subtle intonations of the mouth. The eyebrows are a little bit too sharp, perhaps. So there's a mixture of naturalism and stylization, but it is an attempt to give the person a permanent flesh. This is, again, very much like later objects like the Mask of Tutankhamun, where the goal is to preserve them into the afterlife. Some other Neolithic objects that are nearby, just across the river in Jordan, at Ain Ghazal, we have these Neolithic figurines that are made from lime plaster. So this is, again, pre-pottery Neolithic, and these are rather broken up, but you can see they have shells for eyes, but they are meant to represent figures, and they were intentionally buried. There is in the ancient world this association with the things below the surface of the earth or the underworld. They represent the afterlife. And so burying these might be a way of passing them on to the afterlife. We generally call these things votives. A votive is something that is given to the gods or to some supernatural entity. Perhaps they represented individuals, or perhaps they were kind of simulacra. A simulacra is a thing that is given as a kind of sacrifice. So maybe they represented a kind of human sacrifice. Well, now we're going to move north, and we're also going to move several thousand years ahead in time to the Neolithic period in Europe. So the Neolithic period in Europe actually is a lot later. Remember that technology gets started in the Near East, and so they're a lot more advanced. They have agriculture, etc. But they also, by the time we hit 4,000, 3,000 BC, they're going to have bronze. But bronze comes late to Europe, so we're still in the Neolithic period at this time. Neolithic Europe doesn't have a lot of large communities. There's not anything even as large as Catalhoyuk or Jericho. They're going to be small villages. They're going to be agrarian. They do have farming. And they're going to have wooden structures. Not a lot of forests in the Near East, so not a lot of wooden structures. Instead, they have structures made out of mud brick or stone. But here in Northern Europe, they have plenty of wood, so they're going to have wooden structures. We also call this period the megalithic period. And so if Neolithic means new stone, megalithic means large stone or big stone. And it is the defining characteristic of these cultures that they have this overwhelming compulsion to erect mammoth monoliths, just single blocks of stone. Most of this is going to be happening in this region, in the British Isles, in France, and in Spain. But we also see a little bit into Scandinavia, but we're not going to find much further than that. There's also a few sites in along the Mediterranean, but this is where most of this is going to be located. And so not surprisingly, we call this megalithic Europe, where we have this development where for nearly 3,000 years we have people erecting large stones. So the megalithic period is from this period here. Stonehenge has several phases of building and started at 4,000 but isn't finished until around 1600. It's hard to believe that that's a nearly 2,500-year-old structure over its history. And then we have Tarxien. Tarxien is a tiny little site. It's a temple on Malta. Malta is an island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Some of these sites are also in Ireland. Ireland's in the British Isles. One of the more important ones is Newgrange in Ireland. The Newgrange is a tumulus. This is a mound of earth. But inside this tumulus is a passage tomb. The passage tomb is a long passage, that's what it is, lined by monoliths. And at the end of it, it has a series of 3 chambers. And those chambers are covered with what we call a corbelled vault. They haven't figured out arch technology, so they just basically put one slab of stone on top of the other, jut it out a little bit, until it gets close enough you can seal the whole thing off with a large stone. It works. It's not terribly strong, but it doesn't have to hold up a lot of weight. As we get to the passage tomb itself, there is a window, a kind of lintel, and then an upper part that allows light to come into it. And there is one day of the year where the light will shine directly down the passage tomb all the way to the chambers at the end. And that's something that's very significant, as we often see that there are astronomical alignments to these structures, and that they took meaning from the movement of the sun, the moon, and the stars and the planets in the sky. Here you can see sometimes they're decorated with little spirals and other motifs. Here you can see that corbelled vault where the registers of stone are laid a little bit over the top of each other. There's also, and it showed up for a second, there we go. I'm not sure why that blipped out of there, but there's also a whole massive monolith that's covered with spirals and chevrons and diamond shapes out in front of the passage tomb itself. There's a whole series of these megalithic types of structures spread all over Western Europe and the British Isles. One of the most common is called the dolmen. These are all Celtic words, and dolmen literally means stone table. The Celtics came into this region and thought that these were built by giants and that they were massive stone tables. You can understand that. But they're not actually tables, they're actually tombs. That there would be 3 massive upright stones. The one on the back has fallen away here. And then the front would be filled with smaller stones, and then a large single slab of stone would be placed over the top. So these were tombs above the ground. Here you can see where this stone has fallen away from the backside here. The other one was the menhir. The menhir is, again, Celtic. It's a Gaelic word for meaning standing stone. And you can see how massive some of these are. Some of these weigh in excess of 60 tons. They're just colossally huge stones. And anytime you see one of these, you have to realize that there's actually 1/3 of the stone is under the level of the ground, so they have their own foundations. There are whole fields of these standing stones in some locations, Probably the most famous is at Carnac. This is in Brittany. This is right across the English Channel from England. And you have just fields and fields of these stones stretching on for 3 kilometers. Thousands of these upright stones in straight lines. The last form that we have is the cromlech. And the cromlech literally means circle place. We sometimes call this a henge. Henge is an Anglo-Saxon word. Cromlech is a Celtic word. But either way, they mean the same thing. They mean a circle of standing stones. And we see circles of standing stones all over Western Europe, all over the British Isles, and also in a bit into Scandinavia as well. The most famous cromlech, or henge, is Stonehenge, which is by far the most famous of these, and it's the largest and most elaborate of any in the British Isles. When we look at this, we usually only look at the center circle of stones, but in reality, there's a lot more to this site than just this center circle of stones. This site is located in southern England on the Salisbury Plain. So if you fly into southern England, on a broad flat plain in the middle of Salisbury, you will find this circle of stones. And you can see from this satellite photo that it's actually a lot more than just that circle of stones. The circle of stones is only the very center of the structure. There's a huge pit, a huge circular ditch all the way around the exterior, and it has avenues. It has little places where you can look out. There are also several other standing stones out on the perimeter where things line up. The most important one is this one here. If you stand in the center, this lines up directly over this stone and out this avenue, and this is the heel stone. The heel stone is located right there. This is it. This is the heel stone. And the heel stone is significant because it marks the rising of the midsummer sun. So on Midsummer Day, the summer solstice, if you were to stand in the exact center of this circle and look out towards the stone, the sun would rise directly over the top of that, as is demonstrated here by my expert drawing skills. And so you could sight that right from the center. So this is one of the foundations for understanding this site, is what we call archaeoastronomy. Archaeoastronomy is the study of ancient sites, archaeological sites, by looking through the perspective of astronomy. We know that natural phenomena were very, very important to people in the ancient world for a practical reason. If you plant your crops too soon, there's a chance they could be subject to frost. If you harvest them too late, they could rot. And so you have to know when to plant, when to harvest, and the best way to do that is to look at the movement of the sun. Hopefully you are aware that the Earth is on a tilt, and this tilt is what creates, it's tilted off from the main axis, and this is what creates the seasons. And so the sun actually moves through the sky relative to the background of stars. And what that means is that every day, as you move towards the midsummer sun, the days get longer, and then after you move past the midsummer suns, they get shorter. The 4 most important days in the ancient world would have been the equinoxes, where the day and the night are equal length. I apologize. Let me take a quick drink. You have the spring equinox, which happens in March. You have the fall equinox, which happens in September. Then you have the winter solstice, which is the longest night of the year and the shortest day. And then you have the summer solstice, which is the longest day and the shortest night. And it's clear that all of these days were important religious holidays to people at the time. But it goes beyond just knowing when the planting seasons are. They actually took great care at this site. If you look at this site, there are really amazing astronomical alignments. Not only does it align to the midsummer sun, but at exactly 90 degrees to the axis that looks for the midsummer sun over the Heelstone here. So you can see this sights out towards the summer solstice sunrise. At exactly 90 degrees, it looks out towards the most northerly moonrise and the most northerly moonset. And that is also lines up with a couple of other features that are exactly 90 degrees to an observation of the winter solstice. Okay? Now here's the thing, this only happens at this location. So at this location and no other location do these astronomical phenomenon line up to be exactly perpendicular at 90 degrees. They actually tried to build an exact copy of Stonehenge in Oregon, but Oregon is, even though it's far more north than us, it's way further north. It's way further south than England. England is way far north, and they couldn't make it work because it wasn't at the right latitude. So the people didn't just decide to build it here for no reason. They built it here because they knew this was a special place. This was a place where the alignments worked just right. That shows that they're considering far more than just the seasons. This had meaning to them. So the earliest construction was a ditch. The ditch was actually begun sometime around 4000 BC. It's quite old. And then the ditch was kind of a sighting that you could sight out from the center of the ditch to the exterior. The next addition, which was maybe 3000 years BC, was the Aubrey holes. Now, the Aubrey holes were discovered by a scholar with the last name of Aubrey, hence Aubrey holes. And we really don't know what these holes were. Here, the artist has recreated this as the holes used to hold stones, and that they are the former foundations of stones that have since been moved. Another theory is that if you count these holes, they actually line up for a cycle. There's 28 of them, and then there's another hole that has a different material, and it has chalk. And maybe was filled with chalk and filled with a different kind of stone. And that lines up, 28 days is about the same time period as a cycle of a moon. So they were using these to record the cycle of the moon. We're really not certain on that. The ditch gets enlarged and it gets expanded over time, and eventually they start moving and putting stones in the center. We start seeing the construction of wooden posts to measure things, and then eventually it becomes the site that we see here today, where we have the center ring, which is what we call the cromlech. The cromlech is built in a series of stages. The first stage was made with what we call blue stones. These are stones that are about 8 to 10 feet high, and they're actually taken from Wales. And then they replace that with the structure that we now know, and which is made out of sarsen boulders. These are the trilithons in the center, and then the cromlech. And these are the ruins of what we see today. So you can still see the ruins of that embankment and ditch, but the cromlech is there. And as you can see, most of the cromlech has been lost. It's now missing, and only a few of the trilithons are still standing. So here is a kind of layout of what they imagine this would have looked like. Here are those blue stones. The blue stones were originally probably in 2 rows around the center, but they kind of bent those and moved those around. And then they moved those when they started putting in the trilithons. The trilithons just means 3 stones, and so you have 3 stones, a lintel, and 2 upright stones. So that's why they're called trilithons. Again, nobody accused archaeologists of having a surfeit of imagination. And then eventually we have the cromlech, which is the kind of circle that goes around it. The blue stones are pretty dang impressive. The blue stones came from Wales, which is quite far away. And you can see by the scale of them that they're still quite large. They probably would have weighed in the area of 5 to 8 tons, depending on the size, and you can tell that they were roughly shaped. Okay, So there was some shaping to these stones. These aren't just straight rough stones. The trilithons are made from sarsen boulders. Sarsen is a type of sandstone, and these were sandstone boulders that were scraped up by the glaciers back during the Ice Age and they just dumped on the landscape when the glaciers retreated. And these came from up to 20 kilometers away, and the largest of these is nearly 60 tons. They're really incredible in terms of their scale. Here's another view of these trilithons. Here you can see them again. And this is as good a place as any to talk about this concept of post and lintel construction. That's the kind of construction they're using here. You can see that there are two vertical members we call posts and a horizontal member we call a lintel. Now this is a type of construction that we'll see a lot of places, but this is one of the earliest examples in human history that continues to exist. You can build this, of course, out of anything, out of wood, and the width of your width of your lintel is limited by the strength of the material. Wood is very flexible and very light, so you could build a broad lintel with that. But stone, you can only build these narrow lintels because stone doesn't have a lot of tensile strength. It doesn't flex terribly well. It has lots of compression strength. That means it doesn't crush. You can pile a lot up on it, but it doesn't have a lot of tensile strength. So let's get to the question. Everybody wonders, how was this built? The one thing I can say is it was not built by aliens. It was built by people, again, made from sarsen sandstone boulders up to 25 miles away. There are some that are nearly 60 tons, but those are the largest. But each is, there are some that are 25 tons. And here are some of the sarsen boulders from the original quarry. The techniques for building this are pretty simple. You can use what's known as an A-frame crane. That is, if you run the ropes over an A-frame made out of logs, this increases your leverage and allows you to lift it. You could also see that you have a weight box here to weigh the end down. The evidence is that they built a pit, and the pit would have the lower third of the stone erected into it, and then through a series of levers and pulling, you could erect it. The other thing that was probably very important was cribbing. Cribbing is a very simple technique. You can see it here diagrammed here, that you get guys with a lever on one side and they basically lever up one side of the stone, and you can lever it up maybe a few inches at a time. Here you see them using a lever, and the stone lifts up, and then you shove a log or a stone underneath it on that side. Then you go around to the other side and you lever up that side. And when you lever up that side, it kind of levers up a bunch, and then you can stick another log underneath it. And you just basically rock this stone back and forth, putting another log underneath it every time. And it will slowly tip from side to side to side to side, getting higher and higher by a few inches at a time, until finally it's high enough that you can push it over the top of the lintels. You're going to hear a lot of things on the History Channel and on YouTube that say this is beyond the technological means of human beings. We could not have built it this way. All of that, of course, is unmitigated BS. It's not true in the slightest. And how do we know that? Because people have been doing this for centuries. As a matter of fact, this is an example. Right up until the 1930s, there was this native tribe in the central mountains of Indonesia in Southeast Asia that was moving monoliths up to 50 tons, and they were doing it entirely with ropes and logs and levers with no modern equipment or cranes, and they were erecting these as monuments to their tribal leaders. And it's absolutely insane that they did it, but they were doing it. You get 80 guys together and you get the logistics together and you know what you're doing. You can move just about anything. And I know, because I've done it myself. This is my lovely wife, and she is looking on a couple of rocks that I rescued from some neighbor's yard. This guy didn't want his stones anymore. So I went over, and with nothing more than levers and ropes, I levered these up into my trailer and hauled them to my house. And they're now in my backyard, awaiting the building of my rock garden and my landscaping. And two of these I did just by myself. The other one I had my brother-in-law help. So that's a work crew of 2 people. Each of these stones is probably about 500, 600 pounds. And, that's just 2 people. Give me a crew of 40 and I can move anything. And you can too. So don't be intimidated by it. And again, other than the trailer and hauling it to the location, everything about moving it around the site I did entirely by hand, just by myself with levers and ropes. It's really pretty impressive. Again, the stones were roughly shaped, and it seems that they shaped them so that they would be a little easier to pull over logs and pulleys and ropes. And they also have this thing we call a mortise and tenon joint. That is, they didn't want these lintels to fall off the top, so they actually carved a socket. And you have a tenon. This is this little kind of bulge here. That's what this is called, and it fits into a mortise. And so this is like something fitting into a socket, like a Lego set. Bet you didn't know what those were called before, but they're called mortise and tenons. And so this is the mortise, and this is the tenon, and it worked pretty darn well. Of course, there's been earthquakes and all kinds of disasters, and Romans and knocking them down, etc. So most of them haven't stood up, but the fact that any of them stood up is pretty remarkable. The last thing we can discuss is, what was it for? Well, it's clearly a kind of solar computer predicting seasons, but I think more importantly, it was built as a ritual site, as a temple. Here are people gathered watching the midsummer sun. Again, this was important, but people associated religious significance to it. And so it was probably built by a community of people. There's no one village or people that we can ascribe this thing to do. There probably were villages from all over the countryside that sent labor to come and to build it. Here's a rather fanciful view of how it was used. There's some that even suggest that maybe it was roofed. I don't think many people think it was roofed today. Archaeology continues to work on the site, and we continue to discover burials. It's a very significant site. Some of these burials are hundreds of years after it was finished, and sometimes thousands of years after it was finished. Some of these burials were built at the time, and we see evidence that there may have been human sacrifice at the site. We don't know. But it's clear that it was a religious site. One of the things that we don't know is who built it. We can say for certain that it was not built by Druids. Druids are the descendants of, modern Druids as a revival of neo-pagan beliefs, but Druids during the Celtic period were the descendants of people who came to the British Isles very, very late. They came in the Iron Age, and this is well before that. This is into the Neolithic period. So these are pre-Celtic Indo-Europeans. And whoever they were, they're not there anymore. They were utterly replaced by the people who came later. Some people suggest it was the Wessex culture. That was a culture that lived in the Wessex regions of southern England, that knew how to work gold and a few other things, but really hadn't figured out bronze. The other suggestion is that it was the Bell Beaker people. The Beaker people are called the Bell Beaker people because they made these drinking cups that are in the shapes of bells. And so the drinking cup is called a beaker. And they may have done it. I think the thinking is today that the Beaker people actually replaced the people who built this. Because it seems that once the Beaker people show up, most of these monoliths stop being worked on and they end up being abandoned. So they were a new culture that came in and conquered the culture that built these. There is some inscriptions on it. Story goes that a tour guide was giving a tour of school children through the site, and as he was going through, he said, "Hey, anybody got any questions?" A kid raises his hand and said, "Yeah, what are the dagger and the axe about?" And the guy was like, "What?" And sure enough, you can see that there's this little inscription of a dagger and an axe head there on it. And this has been tested, and this did date to the time period. So if there are daggers and axes, that suggests that maybe this was a sacrifice site. There's one other monolithic site we want to take a look at, and that is in Malta. This is the site of Tarxien, or Tarxien if you prefer, and it is a temple place that exists probably before 3000 BC, so it's a very old site. Now, Malta is a tiny little island to the south of Sicily. There it is. There it is blown up. And right inside one of their main cities is Tarxien. And Tarxien is a temple complex. The temple complex is partially built out of monoliths, and part of it is cut right into the living bedrock. It's really cool. Here's a plan, and you can see that it has a series of entrances into these lobe-shaped temples that are all lined with stones, and that ultimately this goes right into the bedrock itself. Here's a reconstruction of perhaps of what it might have looked like. You can see that it's built out of just colossal stones, and it would have been roofed. There's a kind of progression of sacred space here, and that's a very common concept that we see in later cultures, that the outer courts are for kind of less important functionaries, and the most sacred spaces are reserved for the high priests or for the god themselves. So there's a kind of progression of space. One of the most impressive monuments is this. This is the opening lintel, post and lintel construction. This is the gate into the main structure. Here you can see it, and it gives a sense of the scale of this thing. This block is just enormous. But there's a whole series of these massive lintels and stones. Take a look at this stone relative to the size of these people. You can get a sense of how big it is. Here is the backside of that lintel we were looking. So this stone here is the backside of this stone here. So here we are looking into the temple, and here we are looking from the sanctuary of the temple back to the entrance of the temple. It's really quite astonishing. Now this also has massive vases, and these are not made from ceramics. These are actually carved from stone. So they carved out this boulder until it was the shape of a vase for offerings. You can see the walls are made out of large blocks of stone. Some of these are decorated in spirals. When you get to the inner sanctuary is carved out of the living rock, and you can see they carved the ceiling into the shape of a corbelled vault. That suggests that the original temple had a corbelled vault, and it's now gone. There is a massive statue at the location, monumental sculpture. This thing is over 5 feet high, and we only have the lower half of it. So presumably there would have been an upper half here. It seems to be a female figure, fertility goddess. It's a little bit debated of whether she's wearing bloomers of some kind, or if she just has a really bad case of cankles. I don't know. I suspect these are bloomers. But you can see that she has feet, and then again she's quite broad, with emphasis on the hips. Again, this is emphasis on the features that are associated with child rearing and childbearing. But it shows that there is some kind of central cult worship. And again, the mother goddess is pretty ubiquitous all across the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. There was some kind of pan-cultural phenomenon of worship of the mother goddess. Some people have taken this to mean that these were matriarchal societies, that they were ruled by women. I think that's probably a mistake. I think the growing evidence is that they were patriarchal societies. We sometimes misinterpret data. We see a female goddess and say, oh, well, this must have been for women. That's a really kind of simplistic understanding. I don't know if you know this, but the most commonly invoked saint in the Middle Ages for military victories was the Virgin Mary. She was extraordinarily popular. She was the champion of kings and military rulers. So she was the personal protector of both Charlemagne and Napoleon in their tradition. So the Virgin Mary, we don't think of the Virgin Mary as a military saint and as a saint associated with men and military rulers, but she was. So who knows? This might be a mother goddess, but it might have been an extraordinarily patriarchal society where women didn't have much rights. Maybe we're looking at it wrong, but it does show that there were concepts of gods and goddesses and central worship and hierarchy and social stratification. But this is all before the existence of writing, so we cannot know for sure. We don't know the names of these gods or goddesses. We don't know the names of these cultures. We call them only after the names of where we found them, or silly things like if they had bell-shaped beakers. We really wish we knew more about that. But that's a good lead-in to our next lecture. Our next lecture is going to be about the ancient Near East and about the rise of the first civilizations in Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkadian, Babylon. And in those cases, we actually know what they called themselves because of the invention of writing. So we're moving from prehistoric cultures, cultures before the invention of writing, into cultures that are historic cultures, cultures we know because of writing. But we'll start that up next time. Thanks for hanging with me, and we'll catch you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.